Welcome to CSP Chapter 8, Emotional and Behavior Disorders, Part 2. Last time we watched videos on some of the different types of emotional and behavior disorders, and so now we're going to watch a few more, and then we're going to talk about some more characteristics of emotional and behavior disorders. The next type of emotional and behavior disorder we're going to talk about are conduct disorders.
Conduct disorder in children is very serious. It's a disorder of childhood and adolescence that is long-term, that's chronic, where children have very aggressive impulses, where children are involved in difficulties with the law, and really seem to have no disregard for the rules or for authority. When children have conduct disorder, they're definitely at risk of carrying these difficulties into adulthood, which also brings about a myriad of different problems. Children with conduct disorder often have difficulties in schools, have difficulty with relationships, and have difficulty with employment and lifelong, long-term relationships. It's important to recognize that if your child is not doing well in school, if your child has had difficulties where legal action was necessary, if your child is bullying, getting into fights, and this is constant and ongoing, if your child does not get help, these complexities will really exacerbate into other major difficulties. Look for signs of your child's grades dropping. Look for signs of repeated detentions, suspensions, and brushes with the law. Parents, please recognize that if your child has signs of conduct disorder, the sooner you get help, the sooner your child can start to learn more adaptive behaviors.
Another type of emotional behavior disorder is aggression.
So, of course, aggressive behaviors in children really is concerning to parents and teachers and even peers and siblings. One of the things we have to realize is that if we see aggressive behavior in children, we really need to intervene early. What causes it? Many different factors. There are genetic components, there are parental-child relationship components, there's unknown stress perhaps in a child's environment, and things that just aren't resolved. Aggressive behavior, of course, can be verbally aggressive, and it can be directed at anyone in the child's life. Aggressive clearly can be physical, and that's very dangerous for those in the child's life as well. One of the things that we know is that aggressive behaviors in children have very specific behavioral intervention plans. The important thing to remember when you're trying to decrease behavior is to follow the treatment plan, to be very consistent, to praise the child when their behaviors are positive, and to not reinforce the aggressive behavior. So please, if you do see signs of verbal or physical aggression in your child, intervene early and seek professional help.
So let's look at the causes of emotional and behavior disorders. We have biological causes that can include brain damage or brain difference, and by that we just mean that for some people they have some parts of the brain that are larger or smaller than other people. The prefrontal cortex, for instance, is the emotional center of the brain, and so for some people that part of the brain may be larger or it may be smaller, and it may cause differences in their emotional makeup. Chemical imbalance, and here we're talking specifically about neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine are all neurotransmitters that are tied to depression, to hyperactivity, and to other emotional and behavior disorders. Genetics, we find that some conditions, for example, depression, run in families, and we believe that there is a genetic component to that. Inborn temperament, about 30% of all people have what's called, what are called easy children, and these people just have a happy temperament. They have, they adapt to change well. About 20% of people are what we call slow to warm children, and these slow to warm children are children that do not adjust to change well, but if you give them time, if you give them room, then they will adjust. And then there are the difficult children, and the difficult children have a very high percentage of ending up with adult emotional and behavioral problems. Environmentally, poverty or at least the circumstances of poverty, can be a cause of emotional and behavioral problems. Family instability, divorce, single parent, both can be a factor. Family stress and violence are definitely factors. Community stability or the lack of community stability can also be a cause for emotional and behavior disorders. So, how do we identify individuals with emotional and behavior disorders? The initial identification, we look at things like behavior age discrepancy. Does this child act younger than they are? Are they engaging in behaviors that are not typical of children their age? Frequency of occurrence. How often is this behavior happening? How many different symptoms are we seeing? Is there evidence of inner suffering for the child? Is he causing harm to others? Does he persist in the behavior even when he's punished? Is he self-satisfied? In other words, does he like his own behavior? And then the severity and duration of the behavior. One of the things we do is we will interview parents and teachers and ask them about the ecology, about the environment of this child. How often does this behavior happen? How long does it last? Under what conditions do you see it? How does it vary from setting to setting? And so, in other words, are we seeing this behavior in multiple settings, or is it tied to a specific setting? Antecedents, what's happening right before the behavior? Consequences, what happens right after the behavior? Where does the behavior not occur? Because that can sometimes be a very important clue as to what's going on. Why doesn't this kid do this in math class, even though he does it in every other class? When does the child do well socially? With whom? What are the times of the day where he's successful? And what's going on in that particular setting? Where does it not occur? When does the child do well socially? With whom? How is the behavior different from other people's behavior? How is this behavior different from this child's behavior in other settings? How much is relational? How much is internal? So, in other words, how much of it has to do with how he gets along with other people, and how much of it is just internal stress? What's been tried, and of what's been tried, what worked? So the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at RTI. Now, you remember we talked about RTI in Chapter 2, and there is a component of RTI that has to do with behavior. So what happens in Tier 1 is we have universal screening. We're going to use explicit teaching of rules and routines. We're going to use research-based classroom management and school-wide screening, looking for the kids that are not behaving as well as other children. In Tier 2, we're going to use point systems, small group interventions, and we're going to teach the child self-control, self-monitoring, self-feedback, and collect data on that. And then in Tier 3, we're going to do what's called functional behavioral assessment and positive behavioral supports. And so what we're going to do is to come up with a hypothesis of what is the child gaining or what is he avoiding through his behavior. And then we're going to try to put supports in place so that the child doesn't feel the need to seek something by this negative behavior, or he doesn't have to use this behavior to avoid other things. And then wraparound services are when we actually bring in external agencies to help us work with this child. So the next thing we're going to look at is interventions. What kind of interventions do we use? Well, teacher behaviors. I need to think about how I act with this child. I'm going to use consequences, not threats. I'm going to avoid power play. I'm going to use logic, not authority. I'm going to ignore just irritating behaviors. I'm going to make his work meaningful. I'm not going to compare one student to another, and I'm going to keep short accounts, which means I'm going to take care of my own mental health. I'm going to use natural and logical consequences. A natural consequence is what happens if I don't intervene. A logical consequence is one that's tied to the behavior. If you're writing on desks, then you have to clean desks. If you leave paper on the floor, you've got to pick up paper. If you're late to class, you've got to make up time. So making the punishment fit the crime, not in the sense of severity, but in the sense that what I'm having the child do is tied to the damage he made or what he missed as a result of his behavior. Teaching problem solving and administering consequences consistently. Wonderful theorist out there named Barbara Colarosa. I recommend you go to her website. It's Kids Are Worth It. She talks about the difference between punishment and discipline. Punishment's adult oriented. It imposes power from without. It arouses anger and resentment. It makes things worse. It's preoccupied with blame and pain. It doesn't look for solutions. It imposes something on a child. It's based on judgment. Discipline is not judgmental, arbitrary, confusing, or coercive. It's not something we do to children, it's something we do with them. It's a process that teaches the child to learn. It's restorative, it invites reconciliation, and its goal is to guide and help children develop self-discipline. How to make discipline work? Well, what we want to do is we want to do restitution, so they've got to make up with for what they've done. We want to use resolution, so we settle it, put it to bed, and reconciliation. We want them to come back and make friends with or connect to the people they've harmed. And consequences should be RSVP, reasonable, simple, valuable, and practical. Teaching social skills is another important thing that we want to do. We want to use cooperative learning, peer training, direct instruction. We want to teach kids direct skills, body language, eye contact, conflict resolution. We want to do transfer of training so that the skills they learn here, they're also going to use at home and they're also going to use on the ball field. We want to teach them self-advocacy, to stand up for each other, and reciprocal friendship, give and take kinds of friendship. A lot of kids who have emotional behavior disorders do not have friends because they are so noxious that nobody will spend time with them. They're very lonely children. And then last, I just want to show you one little thing on bullying. It's not in your chapter, but I just wanted you to see it. That when we see bullying, the way you're going to have to take care of bullying is to break the cycle. The cycle says we have a bully who has a follower, who has a supporter, who has a passive supporter. They like the bullying even though they don't take part in it. They get a big kick out of watching it. Disengaged onlooker, a kid who just stands and watches. Passive defender, he doesn't like the bullying, but he doesn't show open defense. And then the open defender, the person who dislikes the bullying and tries to help the victim. What you have to do to get rid of bullying is you can't do much about the henchman or the active supporter, but what you can do is make it unpleasant for the passive supporter, engage the disengaged, give support to the passive defender, and help the defender to gain people to help him stand up. Okay, this is chapter 8.